Welcome to the Future of Life Institute podcast. My name is Gus Duggar, and I'm here with Emilia Javorsky, who's also from the Future of Life Institute. Emilia is the director of the Futures team at the Future of Life Institute. Emilia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Gus.
Great. We're talking today about power concentration. Why is that something we might worry about?
Yeah, so power concentration is something we think about in general in our society, where power is already fairly concentrated into a few hands. But that's distinct from what we talk about when we think about AI, because AI driven power concentration risks concentrating power into the hands in even far fewer people than it already is. And so, from my perspective, there's something really wrong if AI enables a single private actor with no outside checks and balances to potentially have the power to choose what future humanity is ultimately going to have. And this is not just something that I'm concerned about. This is something that even the leaders of major labs have talked about. They've gone sort of on the record talking about the fact that they're uncomfortable with the amount of power that developing and deploying these systems take, and that at some point this probably shouldn't be in the hands of just private actors because that level of power concentration would be undemocratic, which is something I think that Dario Amodei has said previously. So that's not something you typically hear from the tech world. And I think that raises some alarm bells, certainly when you hear it, and also when you see the dynamics unfolding about the level of power concentration and just across how many dimensions that power exists.
What do you mean by dimensions here? What are the multiple dimensions where we could have power concentration?
Yeah, so I think when people hear concentration of power, the most common sort of analogy in regular speak is when people think about wealth inequality or income inequality. That is certainly one dimension. So, financial power and concentration of capital is an aspect of this. And we're talking about potentially concentrating capital at rates far, far higher than they even are today, especially when many of these labs see AI as sort of a winner take all dynamic, and whoever is that winner effectively could almost take over the economy. But there's other dimensions we need to think about as well. So, there's political power. There's relationships that companies have with governments. We've already seen quite a bit of this in the big tech era of sort of recent times with social media and the lack of actually meaningful rules and legislations and guardrails being passed there. But we are seeing it today in sort of big tech lobbying against AI guardrails and having quite a bit of influence over sort of the trajectory that government regulation has. We see that in the power of labor. So what's really interesting is before it's been quite separate, where people are doing the work and then they're working for companies. What AI sort of introduces to the table is by being able to do more and more tasks that a human could potentially do, you have this replace function of human beings and GPUs. And so now you have a single company that could control the labor workforce. There's the power of attention, right? Our attention as citizens, what we pay attention to, what content we consume, how we feel, right? In seeing sort of the dawn of AI being used as companions or sort of ways that can sort of emotionally hack us. So each of these dimensions is, you can debate whether or not the concentration in today's world is healthy or not, but the world we're heading towards is one where this gets very, very much more concentrated. And the result of that is, a fundamental sort of disempowerment of people. It probably is going to curtail innovation quite a bit in sort of that kind of monopoly dynamic. And then you're going to end up with sort of a monoculture, right? Which is also something I think most people don't want to live in. So I think this is all sort of quite scary dynamics. And I guess the last point I would say on that is that you don't need artificial general intelligence or super intelligence for this to happen. And so I think that's another point that gets confused in the conversation is like, oh, well, this sort of AI functional takeover of society where we all end up disempowered is a function of super intelligence. That I don't think is the case. We're already, with the sort of technology and capabilities we have, very much on the trajectory to end up in a situation where most people in the world end up not being empowered or being able to choose what future they want.
Yeah, I think when you say power concentration caused by AI development, I think some people will think of totalitarian surveillance states, and other people will think of big tech monopolies. And so, how do you think is it useful to talk about those two categories of risk under the common umbrella term of power concentration from AI?
Yeah, I think it is helpful to talk about those as sort of categories. You could also have them be a single entity, right? Which is a surveillance state by a big tech monopoly. So when we think of surveillance state, we always assume that it's the state that's doing the surveilling. But in this case, I think there are possible futures here where that surveillance state is enabled by a private entity and extends beyond borders, right? That's the thing of being in the digital sphere. Could you have this not just be a surveillance state in the case of respecting state borders, but within sort of a global surveillance state? So yes, in general, I'm quite afraid of that. And I think that there's like quite Orwellian dynamics already afoot. And those I think could potentially quite continue, and happy to delve into what those are of interest.
I'm just worried that there might be a lot of basically market demand for these big tech companies that drive this concentration of power. So is it just the case that consumers just want what these companies are offering, and that is what is causing power to concentrate? And does that make it more difficult to push back, perhaps?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that none of these companies yet have a viable business model, right? So it's not that the demand is coming because consumers are asking for what it is that they're providing. They're certainly using it.
And just for the listeners, the companies we're talking about are companies like OpenAI, Google DeepMind, and Anthropic, for example.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it's actually really worth making that point clearly, that the AI driven power concentration we're talking about is these very large general purpose systems that are only being developed by a handful of companies. So this is not that AI in general will lead to this result. AI could actually be used to decentralize power and create some really cool new structures and institutions and technologies that make it actually more empowering for us all to live if we choose to develop it that way. This risk that we're talking about AI driven power concentration, is from a very, very narrow set of actors and systems.
Yeah, yeah. And because we're worried about power concentration from AI, we are launching an RFP. What is an RFP, and what is this RFP about?
Yeah, so we are launching an RFP, which is a request for proposals. We think that AI driven sort of power concentration is a very urgent problem, given how quickly these systems are moving ahead, how many different domains of society they're starting to permeate, and how much more and more capable they are, and the fact that companies are very much locked in a race in this dynamic. So we've seen this of like demo days happening a day with it, so within a day of one another, right? Like it's very salient how quickly this is moving. Given that accelerant that is happening in the AI conversation, that makes this question around power concentration, I think, probably one of the most pressing problems of our time. And it's not one that is really being happening as a societal conversation. Even when we think about the conversation around AI and risks of AI and downsides of AI, the power concentration piece has been like a side mention, but not really central to the conversation. And so this is a conversation we need to have happening as a society. So an RFP is on one level saying like, hey, this is a really important topic we need to think about. And on the second piece of it is we're putting some money behind it to identify what potential solutions are. So this is really a call for solutions, institutions, ideas, tools that can start to take on this question and figure out how we start to steer in a different direction, and also spark the thinking of folks who may have a tool or an idea that's in somewhat of a related field or hasn't thought about working this on this problem, to say like, hey, this is a problem, here's some funding, show us what you can do.
What's something you would be excited to see here? What would be an example of a proposal you'd be excited about?
Oh, there's so many different, because this extends through so many different domains. I think that there's like just so many cool ways you could start to tackle this problem. There's the idea of public AI, right? What does the AI look like? People developing it or governments developing it or funding it. There's the ideas of what are new ways that AI could actually empower people, right? So could you have a loyal AI assistant that actually does a lot of negotiation on your behalf and make sure that you're sort of empowered and informed in ways that, like, all of us getting bombarded by terms and conditions and check boxes and unable to navigate cannot. There's new ways that AI could enable us to cooperate. And I think cooperation is a key piece of actually building to critical mass for change and finding sort of new ways for people to cooperate in a society where perhaps the traditional ways have been eroded. We're more isolated. We're less part of communities. There's less sort of avenues to sort of come together and develop sort of collective and collaborative ways of working. AI is really interesting in like different tools that it could unlock in that domain. So they could be all kinds of different things. I think things to be mindful of when we think about developing this is like they have to be pragmatic, right? And so that's one of the challenges when thinking about different ways of doing things is you can reimagine sort of a totally different structure of incentives, right, for these companies, but how do you bridge the here to there? And so I think the challenge is figuring out like how do you actually come up with ideas that perhaps start at a nascent level, but have a viable path to scaling and happening in the real world.
You mentioned having this loyal AI assistant as a helper. I guess we're about on the verge of seeing these kind of AI agents that can help us, draft our emails and respond to things and organize our calendars. And those agents will have multiple different constraints. So they'll be constrained by what the company wants them to do, and they'll be constrained by what the user is interested in. Do you have ideas for how to balance those two constraints? What do you do if the user wants to do something that the company doesn't want? Or if the company wants to kind of force the user in a certain direction? What would be empowering for the user in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why you need sort of independent development of these tools, right? So you need system or an agent or a companion or whatever that may be your assistant that has sort of a fiduciary responsibility to you and to your best interest, because I think it is very difficult for any user to ascertain, like, is this recommendation from the company in my best interest or is it in the company's best interest? There's just fundamentally misalignment there between your what's best for you and what's best for a company. So I think that's where some of this work around public AI or in R&D and sort of developing things that are outside of companies, which is challenging for a whole host of reasons given sort of economics of this situation, but is a really interesting and viable path. I would add to that information and being able to make sense of information is another domain in which I think we'd be excited to see proposals and is really important of like, how do we actually ensure we're getting accurate information? What are tools for improved sense making? Because a big aspect of power concentration comes through not having a common vernacular for all of us to be able to speak to one another on, right? When we see sort of floods of disinformation online and synthetic content and being sort of put in ideological bubbles from recommender algorithms. So tools that can help break some of that and get us back to sort of a common ground of like, all right, what are the facts? And let's start making decisions from the facts, I think is another sort of tool that can be helpful there.
Some listeners might be thinking right now, Emilia, we have the solution to power concentration from AI. It's open source. If you have open source AI, one company is not in control of that AI. And so maybe we should talk about the pros and cons of open source as a method of decreasing power concentration.
Open source, I think, is helpful, but not sufficient. And I'll kind of go into why that is. Also, it's important to say, like, what do we mean by open source? Because open source has historically meant one thing. And I think people are sort of flinging the language of open around and doing some hand waving when it comes to AI, because open is signaled as a good thing. And so there's a lot of people taking advantage of the fact that that's great branding and, trustworthy branding.
Does open source mean that the model weights are out there for people to download, or that the training set is out there for people to download? It can mean a bunch of different things, and you can open source to different levels.
Totally. And like, I think what people tend to mean by this is the open model weight framing of it, which is that the model weights are open, you can build on them and you can tune them for a specific application. But there's a paper I highly recommend by Meredith Whitaker of the Signal Foundation that like goes into this question of like really delving in, like, what does it mean to be open or not open? And even under sort of the more radical definitions of open, they really argue that that still is not going to necessarily meaningfully solve the problem that we're talking about, which is this issue of power concentration and undemocratic uses of AI. So I think there is actually some danger into seeing open source as the solution, because for lack of a better term, it's power washing. It's like the idea that you're solving this problem with a strategy that is not actually going to solve the problem. So it's something that certainly is going to be, in some cases, helpful, especially for realizing benefits of AI and being able to like tune certain models to different applications, to do scientific research, to do education, to do like all the amazing stuff that AI can do. And I think models should be as open as they can, as long as they're safe, and we shouldn't be developing models that aren't safe. So my argument would be like most things should be open. But the reality here is that, like, at the end of the day, these frontier models cost hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion to train. So this is like prohibitive from like most small actors or other actors actually like being in this game and being able to develop sort of a truly open model, and they will just always have a competitive sort of edge. And we've seen this in open source past, right? Like big tech is still an industry, even though we have a lot of open source tech. And so if open source was the sort of be all and end all of being able to take on this problem, like our current landscape of technology would look very, very different. And there's even pieces here that are kind of getting at that disempowerment piece. So we think about Meta has been at the forefront of this open source conversation. We're opening it up and isn't this great? Well, part of what they're doing is opening it up so people can build really new cool things that one would argue they could then feed back into their product offerings, right? And so you're essentially outsourcing free R&D to the open source community that you can then sort of develop products on. So I would be quite careful. There's also, once things are open, there's no liability. Liability becomes a lot more difficult to prove. And so there's other like sort of interpretations one could have, is like opening things up is also a way to try and diffuse the liability questions as well.
Why do you think Meta is taking the strategy of open sourcing their models? Is it, as you mentioned, because it might come back to, in terms of it might allow them to outsource their R&D to developers, or is it also because they perhaps want to initiate a race to the bottom in model cost? So if you have open source competitors to the leading corporations, that might hurt Meta's competitors, which would be good for them.
I mean, this is something you and I guess have spoken about in the past, which is like the whole commoditizing the complements argument and the long history here. This is not the first time that tech companies have opened up something for a competitive business advantage. For people who aren't familiar with the term, commoditizing complements essentially means that you want to drive the price of products that complement yours down to the lowest amount you can to increase demand for your core products. So like you can think of like cars and gasoline in this model, right? Like the cheaper the gasoline is, the more attractive it becomes to actually buy the car. So this can be both a strategy for your own business, but also a strategy to sort of kneecap your competitors' business that where the complement is their core business, even though it's not the core one to you. So this has been like a common example of this is like Google and Android with operating systems, right? And like by having a free operating system, you drove down the cost of the Android. It was able to be offered at sort of a much sort of more democratic price. And that was sort of an assault to Apple with its proprietary operating system. So this is not just like then there's many examples of sort of like tech history past of this happening. So to your point, guess there's one piece here of like, well, why would they train this model that's very expensive and then just make it freely available? Because arguably I would argue they're not in the AI business. That is not the core sort of their Gen AI is not the core AI business of something like Meta. It's all of these different product offerings they have, like Facebook and Instagram and other arenas that could really benefit from having AI features that are sort of delivered on them. They also are in a landscape where, big tech is sort of, we have an architecture of like who are the players in that, and a general consensus that they're sort of competitors against one another. So there are companies in there that are looking at AI as like, could this be a core business? And so by making sort of another available alternative free, it's posing a challenge to sort of the business strategy of those that are going to be investing in the models as the business.
Yeah, yeah. And so, what is the problem with that? What is if it might be it might be a benefit to Meta, but could it be a benefit to Meta and a benefit for developers and consumers as well, or is there some hidden cost to this?
The answer is both. Like having an open source model that's comparable to what's happening in sort of the private hands has been extremely helpful for academics doing research, right? Like in terms of, and even those doing AI safety research, right? Because those doing AI safety research need to be able to have a model that's somewhat state of the art to play with and access and like have visibility into to do the kinds of experimentation that they need to do to make progress in the field. So I think that like is a really important piece here. I would say when we think about what is it we ultimately want from AI, we want AI to solve problems and like move fields forward. There's debate as to whether or not these general purpose models are necessarily the best way to do that. Like a lot of what we've seen of like AlphaFold and antibiotics and new fusion reactor designs have all kind of come out of bespoke systems that were trained on a very like specific set of data and not necessarily these large models. So I think there's probably some marginal benefit for AI benefit. I would still argue that like a lot of the AI benefit we could get going today is probably more in on the narrow side. But there is the question of like races to the bottom, as you said, right? In the sense of like, all right, it's great to have something open and available to do research on AI safety. Well, do we know that that model is safe that we actually released, right? And sort of by creating these competitive pressures to go faster and cut corners, what you collectively have is like another accelerant in this race that is already a very dangerous path that we're on.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the difference between these general purpose models, which would be ChatGPT, for example, these models kind of aspire to become artificial general intelligence, and there are several companies developing these models. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have something like AlphaFold, a specialized system that does one thing at a superhuman level. These are kind of two different visions for how to develop AI. You could have a narrow superhuman AI, or you could try to develop an AI system that's general and that's more capable than humans across a wide range of domains. Which one of these visions do you think is best from the perspective of avoiding power concentration?
My sort of answer there is both what is best for avoiding power concentration, but also what is best for actually realizing the AI benefits, both from like realizing benefits, but also for maintaining a sort of highly competitive environment where there's actually like a lot of incentive to innovate and build and sort of create new things. So when you are looking more on the sort of bespoke AI side of like using AI to solve problems, like it's the answer of like, why are we developing AI in the first place, right? Ostensibly, it's because we want to solve the problems that we have and take ourselves forward and realize like really cool futures with technology. And so getting started on like, how can AI actually be applied to solving a lot of those key bottlenecks that we have in science, in manufacturing, in material science, in some ways in education, right? In these more like development oriented goals, in climate. There's just like so many areas that right now should be on fire with investment dollars and teams and like startups happening of like harnessing this technology to actually develop solutions to those problems. And like we should be in this sort of golden era of collective building and collective like problem solving with everything that's like coming online in the forms of these technologies. I think that that is the like world that I would really like to live in. That's the world where I see AI creating a whole bunch of like different companies in a competitive environment that like keeps moving forward and like the forces of capitalism keep kind of steering it in the right direction. I think the other vision of this, which is like a few companies locked in a race to build a superhuman general purpose system, is not necessarily in any ways going to be helpful for power concentration. I think it is the worst scenario for power concentration. I think it is also probably one of the more dangerous scenarios across the board from like a geopolitical standpoint, from an AI safety standpoint, from a, ability to preserve a society of choice standpoint, which I think is like really, really important. So yeah, I'm squarely in the former category more so than the latter.
Okay, so we've kind of established, or we've at least talked about, that we are not interested in having a few companies race to develop superhuman general intelligence, and perhaps open source is not enough to prevent power concentration. What else do we have on the table? What in terms of incentive structures? This is something I know you care a lot about. How can we design institutions that encourage development of AI in a positive way?
So I think there's many different levers that you can start to think about here. I think there's one that's like on the policy making side, which means what we traditionally think of as what sets the levers for the rules of the road in sort of a society. So there are things that we already have, like antitrust, right? This idea that like we should not have a monopoly is like very much encoded into the bread and butter of what government does. Another area that is like pretty sort of ingrained in our society, but less so in tech up until this point, but should be, is liability and sort of strict liability provisions. Because what you effectively see in these more like monopolistic dynamics is that companies are taking more and more risk and they're shifting the negative externalities of that risk onto society versus the corporate entity. And they're able to do that in part because of the lack of liability provisions for that shifting and sort of architectures for establishing liability for that shifting. So I think that's another piece that needs to be sort of taken on. There are nationalized like investment strategies here. Like you could imagine like the public AI idea, sort of a national project that belongs to the citizens of a country to develop AI, like a Manhattan Project or in the national labs, and it's done with very sort of high safety standards. You can imagine sort of nationalizing or lots of public investment that actually belongs to the public and not private entities. Things like compute and sort of inputting sort of general restrictions on how much compute any single entity can use. And then there's like the general thing that governments can do, which is like create guardrails and standards that create a race to the top. And so like one area I think about is, by background, I'm a physician and scientist. So I think of like, where did the FDA do well and where did the FDA do really badly? So lots of problems with the modern FDA. But if we go back in history to the origins of the FDA, I mean, it was a wild west of just like snake oil and claims and toxic products that were on the market. And by the FDA sort of coming in with their Modernization Act, they basically set standards. And the standards were like, hey, these things need to be safe, right? And so what it effectively did was reset this industry where consumers couldn't tell what was safe, what wasn't. They were taking on all this risk, and created a sort of a bar that everyone had to pass in order to get their products on the market. And so as the agency evolved, there was this thing where like, you have to be as safe or better, right? And by putting the as safe or better standard on there, you created an incentive to develop systems that were aligned with safety, right? So there's plenty of examples of this in aviation and other high risk industries, of like setting a bar and incentivizing being at that bar or better than that bar, and that bar then being internalized as a core value of the industry, because that is the bar to which they're held and which consumers will ultimately hold them to. So I think those are all sort of like, what are ingredients that governments could potentially employ and act to try and tweak incentive structures. I don't think those are the only ones that exist. Like, I think there are also, we have collective power as a society, as consumers, to figure out what it is we want in the world. And I think that AI tools to like enable more collaboration and cooperation could be like a very interesting incentive and sort of area of that. I think we look at what happened with like central banks and crypto, like people can develop things that are cool and take on existing systems, right? Like that is very possible. And so I think that is another area that warrants a lot of sort of thinking and investigation. And I would say, again, it's really urgent, because the most collective agency that we have as sort of humanity, as citizens, is today. As these systems get more and more capable and power gets more and more concentrated, our leverage and agency goes down, which is why we really need to get started on like really tackling this problem.
I think these decentralized solutions might be some of the most interesting if they can work. How do you see the prospects of kind of a decentralized development of AI?
So I think in terms of like, what are decentralized strategies to take on this question, I think we've seen, we talked about this a little bit with public AI sort of development. That could be by a government, or that could be by a collective. If we've seen like with many sort of other areas of sort of decentralized organizations or DAOs, we've seen them in science, we've seen them in like many other fields, to enable people to collectively do things and basically create a digital infrastructure that previously only existed in sort of physical form. So like in the science field, you basically created the equivalent of like a digital academic medical center to enable people all over the world to do research in sort of a decentralized way. So I think there's other ways we could like take a decentralized approach to building. I think that there's really interesting work happening of some organizations like the Collective Intelligence Project, who are looking at basically new AI enabled tools to incentivize democratic behavior. So this goes everything from like citizen assemblies to new ways of preference, sort of soliciting preferences and preference aggregation, which is quite cool. So I think there's a lot of different sort of ideas brewing out there. I think a problem with the decentralized model is there's lots of ideas that are prototyped in this space. The challenge is getting those ideas to scale and to reach sort of critical mass in order to have impact. And I think that's something we'd be super excited to see on sort of going back to the RFP piece, is like, what are tools that we can do to like actually scale these decentralized entities? And like, when you're a corporate entity, you have a marketing budget and a marketing team and a whole corporate sort of wind in your sails in order to get products out into the world and make them grow. And so what are ways that we can do that with these entities that don't have that? And like, could there actually be decentralized ways of creating that corporate infrastructure for growth? So that's an area that I think I agree with you is very promising and would like to see more activity happening in. And one other point that I want to add on the decentralization side of this is also on the sense making side, which I think is very important. So we've seen tools come online like X's community notes or other sort of entities that are trying to do sort of news aggregation like Public Editor or Verity.news that are trying to basically use the community, use decentralized infrastructure to help us get better decisions and better information and challenge the sort of information that we're given, and like realizing the power of the collective can actually be a really powerful antidote to sort of misinformation and disinformation and attempts to sort of erode our epistemic foundation as a society. So I think a lot of those tools are also really exciting. They're not squarely at the power concentration, but they're squarely at the foundation on which that is built, and the foundation that we need to have solid if we're actually going to take on the problem.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this earlier that if you have a concentration of knowledge or information into a few hands, that is in itself a form of power concentration. So we've talked about how we want to avoid a race to develop superintelligence that results in a lot of power concentration. Maybe we should talk a bit about what future we actually want. Tell me to what extent you're a techno-optimist.
So I am deeply techno optimistic, which like sometimes you can't tell when we talk about risk. And I think people tend to like to talk about risk more than benefit, like having to been in this area for a while and doing both work on the risk side and on the benefit side. It's just the risk side tends to get a lot more attention given the incentive structures of information that we exist in. But the benefit side is the one I'm really excited about. And that's like why I do this work in the first place. By training, I'm a physician and scientist. With sort of my academic hat, I research basically how to make people more resistant to radiation through different drugs, different strategies, with the hope that we will one day get off the rock and go to space. And so it's very much in my DNA. I was formerly an entrepreneur. That technology has the power to change society for the better. And I think one of the collective sort of tragedies we have in the information space is we're not techno optimist enough in the right way. So I think that, there is this collective zeitgeist that it's impossible for our best future to be ahead of us, that people are kind of resigned to this feeling of, well, it's not going well, and therefore it's going to continue to not go well, and a technology future that's dystopian is inevitable, which is the like total wrong frame of mind to have. Like, things are actually way better than they were to historical norms. Like, we may not think things are getting better. Overall, there are a lot of things that are getting better. There are some really big, unique challenges that we have now, which is like the work that we do at FLI is like, what are some of the unique challenges that were posed by that getting better that we need to solve and break through to get to the next phase. But this idea that our future is inevitable is just nonsense. Like, we are building technology, we're building the future. There are solutions to all of the problems that we've highlighted. Those solutions are within our grasp, either to do via collective action or through technology research and architecting. And so like getting people excited about that and like believing that, I think is actually also one of the most important priorities of our time. Because if people are not excited to innovate and to build and to solve problems in order to get someplace great, like we're just going to not solve those problems, and we're not going to build, and we're not going to do anything, and we're going to sort of succumb to this like doomy inertia that we're all under. So I'm like super bullish on technology, and I think that like my bullishness is also the reason that we need to be careful that we don't, drive off a cliff or get ourselves into a future where we've taken that ability to, let capitalism do its thing and innovate and build companies and build new technologies off of the table by nature of having a world where we're kind of stuck in a monopoly or sort of digital authoritarianism.
One of the results of AI concentrating power might be that money or economic resources in general are also extremely concentrated. What can we do to fight against that? What are some interesting options here?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ideas about that. I think I'm kind of always reminded of the Arthur C. Clarke quote, which is that the goal of the future is full unemployment so we can play. So that's quoted quite a bit. But the second sentence after that was, that's why we have to destroy the present political economic system. And so I think that kind of sums it up, where it's like, yeah, all right, if we get to a future of like true abundance, and I think there's arguments to be made that we are already relatively in a period of abundance compared to historical norms, and there's not a lot of great evidence of people who control abundance developing redistribution mechanisms for it. So figuring out like how we actually have a forcing function on that will be important. But this idea of like, how do you then redistribute that? So this is schemes like universal basic income has been talked about in this area. People have talked about universal basic compute. The sort of Alaskan dividend is another example that's been touted as like mechanisms for sort of redistribution. And this is something that actually in the futures program, my colleague Anna is working on, which is the idea around the windfall trust and the windfall clause. So this is an idea that if a single entity were to get to a certain amount of the GDP, that it would then be distributed to the global sort of population, which is a great idea in principle, but like, how do we actually reduce that to practice? What does that mean? Is that the corporate entity is distributing it? What is the mechanism of distribution? Is it governments that are doing it? Is it an independent entity like a trust that is doing that? Like, how do we find everyone in the world that needs to get that? Is it just, within borders throughout humanity? There's a lot of questions that have to be thought through here, and they need to be thought through and prototyped and pressure tested now, because when that day comes, you need pre-commitments and a plan to have any hope of this working. Like, I'm always, again, I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. And I always think about like at Mount Doom, you have like the best little hobbit in the whole world with this pure soul, and he still can't throw the ring into Mount Doom, right? Like when it comes to like giving up power, the like absolute power corrupts absolutely is just like key here. So figuring out and sort of pre-specifying ways to actually have a forcing function on redistribution when we get to that point is like a really important priority.
And the idea here would be that companies would pre-commit to distribute funds if they reap enormous benefits from their development of AI, so that they would be legally obliged to distribute a bunch of money to either citizens of a country or everyone in the world. Do we have examples of companies signing such a pledge or anything like such a pledge?
Yeah, so a few of the companies have committed to the windfall clause, so it's worth looking that up, which is the notion of doing this. It's not the plan for doing this, and the devil is always in the details. So I think specifying what that plan is will be very important. Another vector worth considering is that level of concentration of capital is probably also going to be accompanied by concentration in sort of the other dimensions. So we need to be thinking also about like, what is a windfall clause equivalent for governance and decision making? What is a windfall clause like entity for culture? Right? Like the idea that we're going to end up in a monoculture just seems like very inevitable at this point. And even just playing with, all AI image generation, you just see this reversion to a mean, right? Like everything you make, you're like, got it. It's like some vaguely cyberpunk or solar punk aesthetic that is in here. I get what you're seeing, AI system, but like to be a truly empowered future for humanity, like we need not only like representation and sort of the data and governance of these systems and benefits of these systems, but also create a world where like choice still exists and there's like a myriad of futures that people can live in, and that respects different values and ideas and cultures and ways of working and ways of engaging with these systems. And I think that point is also one that gets sort of sidelined a little bit in the conversation because people really focus on the capital, and the capital is a very important thing to focus on. But like, I also don't want to live in a future where like all of humanity is prescribed this one culture and way of thinking and set of values that was built into it today in the Bay Area, which is arguably not the most representative place of humanity's ideas, values, and sort of ways of living.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a weird coincidence if the perfect representation or the perfect instantiation of human values were developed in the Bay Area right now. And so we definitely don't want this monoculture. Please say more about like why do you think we're headed in that direction? And what is it that you're seeing? Is it just because a lot of the models, the top models, have been kind of fine-tuned in a specific way to give you a result that incorporates the values of some humans that were part of the process of doing reinforcement learning from human feedback? What is causing this monoculture, do you think?
I would first say that there is no perfect representative human future. And I think all attempts that have been to do that are just destined to fail, right? Like we just are way too diverse in our ideas and preferences and sort of ways of living that like there one person's utopia is another person's dystopia, and like that's just never going to be reconciled across the board, nor do I argue it should be. Like, as a biologist, monocultures die, they're vulnerable. Like, you need a diverse landscape of cultures and ideas, and like this is why diversity is just important from the level of like survival and like resilience of institutions. I think that what you see is partly what you're alluding to. Yes, that like you have a specific form of data that's trained, that it's mainly being used in English, that is being fine-tuned in specific ways to say what's good, what's bad, what's hate speech, what's not hate speech, what's we like, what we don't like, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. But I think the problem is that that's the only systems that are being built right now is reflecting that worldview. So we don't really have sort of the counterfactual of like, what does systems look like that are built with a very different set of input data, with a very different set of sort of tuning? Because we don't have that, it becomes really difficult to like see the differences in the outputs and see the differences in the user experience. They're also being released in an incentive structure that is dominated, right? Like, it's no coincidence that like Silicon Valley is the product of the incentive structure that we have, and that's what it's enabled it to be so prolific and generate so much capital and wealth in society. And so it is also those incentive structures acting on that system and how it behaves in the real world that are further sort of tailoring it and tuning it towards a specific culture. And it's also the culture of the values that it's being sort of released into. So I would say those are sort of two pieces here, both the system itself and then the environment around it and that's incentivizing and not incentivizing.
Are there any other projects that the Futures team is working on that you want to highlight here?
Yeah, so the Futures team is working across a variety of different projects. Our general charter is that second half of the tree. So if you were fans of FLI back in the day, our original logo was a tree. And on one side, it was like very dead. And on another side, it was like very leafy and green. And so the Futures team is the leafy and green side of FLI, which is how do we actually realize the benefits that technology has to offer, right? And so this power concentration piece, you could be like, wait, how does that relate to a good future? But it's developing the tools that enable an empowered human future, right? Like that's the other way. It's not just anti-power concentration, it's pro-human agency, it's pro-democracy, it's pro-diversity of ideas. So that to me is like also at the essence of this. It's not just solving the problem, it's creating the tools and institutions and technologies that enable the futures that we want. I think another step in there is like envisioning what futures we want, and it's like getting people to think about that, like what future would you want to live in, not in a prescriptive way, but in a way that like encourages ideation and getting people excited. Like we have so much dystopian narratives of the future that are out there, and there's many reasons for this. Like one is if it bleeds, it leads, right? Like people like dark and scary stuff. It clicks, it gets views. It's just like our brains are hardwired to pay attention to it. But the other piece of it is like there are just challenges in imagining things going well. Like, it is very easy to do dystopian work because it's all cautionary tales, and it's all like, how do you break something? Like, well, how did this thing break the existing thing that worked? It is so infinitely much harder to think, how do you build something new? How do you build something exciting, right? Like, it's really, like, we know it's really easy to complain about stuff. It's really easy to break things. It's way, way harder to like make solutions and think up solutions and like bring them into the real world. And that's been a challenge that we've just seen in general as our society has kind of moved away from that. Like, the digital world is very attractive because it doesn't have like all those problems that atoms have of like trying to make stuff happen in the real world. And it doesn't behave the way you want, and you have to scale it, and it's difficult, and there's like all of these challenges. But like, instead of seeing it as difficult, we should see it as exciting. We should see it as like the things that we need to do to get where we want to go. And like, the more and more we just like play in the digital world, it's just inertia. Like, we're not actually moving anywhere, like, until the sort of success metric of AI will be the things that it dreams up. How good are we at making those actually happen? And like, right now, we need to do a lot of work on figuring out the infrastructure, the talent, the stories and narratives that get kids excited, that get, people excited in the culture to actually like take on that task. Because that will be like, do we realize the potential or not of AI really hinges on that. It's not on the AI.
Why is it so difficult for us to imagine positive futures? I think you're right that dystopias are just much more common in fiction and in entertainment in general. We don't see, even when I try right now or in general to imagine a positive future, it might be something like relaxing on the beach, but that's a very limited vision of what we might achieve, right? And I think this is a general feature of whenever humans in the past have tried to imagine utopias, we end up with something that's limited, and that says a lot about maybe the problems that people were facing when they imagined this utopia. What if we could have infinite food and so on? This is now a solved problem in parts of the world, at least. So is there some evolutionary explanation here where it's just more important to be aware of threats than it is to imagine positive visions?
As a biologist, I'm obliged to say yes, because we do have much more salient memories and experiences of bad things that happen to us. It's why we're hardwired to be afraid of spiders and certain, other things in the world. But I would say the amazing thing about being human and having consciousness and having imagination is like, we can vanquish and get over those evolutionary hurdles that have sort of been built into us. And I think there are great examples of this. Star Trek was a pretty hopeful sci-fi series. You look at like H.G. Wells's Things to Come, which was another like really interesting and hopeful narrative. So like, these things do exist. Even in its own way, things like Avatar are kind of, very hopeful and optimistic in thinking about the future. I reflect on like, where was there a time, or was there a time where the zeitgeist was different in sort of society? And I think we can look to like a lot of the stuff that we think about techno-utopianism or positive futures. There was like a renaissance of this in the 60s. Like, one of my favorite sort of artwork series is done by NASA Ames, and it was like imagining human space colonies based on the state of the science. And they hired these artists to like draft what the colonies would look like. And like, during that Apollo era, like, people were super excited about science and what it meant for society and where it was going to take us. And we were going to have the Jetsons, and we were going to have flying cars, and like, we were just going to like keep up the pace. And like, had we actually kept up that level of investment into the sciences and technology and motivation, like, we may be living in a very different actually future today. But like, that has existed before in our society, and it existed at a time where it wasn't the rosiest time in the world, right? Like, it was a really heightened time of tensions. And so this idea that like, when times are dark, it's naive to be hopeful. It's actually, when times are dark and things are not working, the only way to get out of it is to imagine something radically different and start steering towards something radically different, because the status quo and the way you've been doing things is clearly not working or taking you where you want to go. And so a key to the Futures program is like, how do we start to lay the groundwork to to get more of us in the mindset of like the techno-utopianism of the 60s than in the gloom and doom that is being like pushed on us today.
Yeah, I'm very glad you made that point actually, because it's an objection I hear to some of the work that the Futures team is doing is that it's, we have so many problems today and we should be focused on the problems instead of trying to develop visions for what we want in the future. But I think it's right that we need something to aim at and we need something to be excited about. Do you think there's some danger in the fact that we're not good at specifying what we want? I'm just thinking very, very naively here that, like, if we cannot specify what we want to an AI that's trying to help us, how do we know when we've gotten what we wanted? If we can't do a very precise specification of our desires for the future, yeah, it's difficult to say that we've succeeded at some point.
I give it to you that humans are terrible at specifying what they want. They're terrible at prospection in general, like really not our strong suit as a species. But we do really know what problems we'd like to solve. And I think that is a very like strong place to start, which is like, what are the things we wish were better? What are the things we wish were different in society? And when you start there and you start like solutioning on the like barriers and like things that are exerting sort of a negative impact on society. So like, we want to get more kids educated. We want to figure out a way to like not only like cure these diseases, but like to prevent age related diseases in general and like dramatically increase our lifespan. We want like really clean, ubiquitous energy. Like we already have that with nuclear. That's a separate conversation. But how do we start getting people excited about these specific use cases, these specific problems, and taking AI to help us solve those problems to start to get into a positive feedback loop. And the positive feedback loop is like, we can work with technology to actually take these things on and solve them. And I think AI also, to what we were saying earlier about like collaboration and cooperation mechanisms and decentralization, like AI can also help to like provide the infrastructure to do sort of these more big Apollo style moonshots and coordinated fashion in a way that like data is shared, data is transparent, data is audited. And those are the sorts of things we need to do to get to where we want to go. So it's some of it is specifying what we want. I think that imagining exercise is really important to like seed in people's ideas what could be possible. But another angle to tackle this at is like, all right, let's just start at what problems we need to solve and let's like get working there. And that's also starting to take you on a positive trajectory. Something we have played with a lot at the Futures program is like world building and developing that methodology out into a course. So sort of the nexus of world building and scenario planning and forecasting to think about like what futures we want and what are key levers to get there. By imagining a world and just saying like a prompt, it's 2045. We're with AI, we've solved these problems, it's gone well. Tell us how that happened. And like making people use these tools to actually architect how that happened is actually a really powerful motivator for folks, because even if you look along your timeline and say, all right, I think there's really low probabilities for certain things to happen, there is a viable path at the end of that. And so like just by nature of architecting and like planning out a viable path from like the present to a future you want to live in is like something that gives you hope and saying like, okay, if the probability is really low, what's the alternative, right? Like you fire for the thing that you want to realize.
Yeah, I think this would be a fantastic attitude for young people, college students to have. What could our educational institutions do differently in order to kind of instill this ambitious attitude where people have a positive vision for what they want in the world?
That starts with paying more attention to like the good things that technology has done for us in society, which is something I don't think is covered that much when we think about how history is taught, how sort of modern life is taught. Like we just kind of take everything that exists today for granted without actually thinking of like the history of the things that enable our lives as they are. Like one of the more like mind-boggling facts when I heard it, and then I was like, that's obvious, is like one of the key drivers of women actually participating in the workforce was the invention of washing machines. which is like, okay, that is like obvious when you say it, but like I never thought of that as like a technology that enabled like a really interesting like social change that unlocked a whole bunch of productivity sort of going forward. So I think like getting people excited about tools and technologies and really like highlighting like how they have made our world better is like an important priority. I think also instilling the sense of responsibility into folks to create the future. Like nobody else is going to create it. Like it's on you. And like we all have a collective responsibility. And I think that's something that's at the heart of FLI as an organization is a lot of the folks within our organization or adjacent to it are scientists and technologists by training. So like we're folks that like build stuff and are with other hats that are like, we actually have a really important responsibility to make sure that this goes well and that the way technology is used in society is one that it goes well. And so I think instilling that in sort of ideas around that of like responsibility around tech, but also responsibility to build tech and responsibility to innovate is really, really important. So a program I really love on this actually is the First Robotics program, which is both like domestic and global, which like encourages teaching kids about robotics and responsibilities and like ethical development of technology, which it's super, super cool and inspirational. So I think there's so much that can be done here. I think educating kids about AI is really important. This is not part of people's curricula, right? Curricula development is like slow and glacial, and like these old like curmudgeon institutions take forever to like update anything, but needing to be a little bit more flexible with like, this is something that's moving really fast. And every year our like course and teaching and values is probably going to have to update and be different. But like, this is key. And kids need to be taught this, not just like at the collegiate level, but like in elementary school, right? So I think creating a more techno-optimistic framework and also a framework where like, you're restoring agency to kids that it's on them to build the future, I think is all things that could help take us in probably a better direction than today's education system does.
So, for listeners who are with us all the way through this episode, maybe we should end by talking about what you can do if you've heard about this RFP on power concentration that we're doing, and you want to contribute. How can people test out whether they can contribute meaningfully here?
We will have our sort of announcement of our concentration of power RFP will be online, and you can take a look at it and see, read it in depth. We have put a bunch of examples there of like ideas for projects. They're just ideas. We're like open to a very broad range of approaches to tackling this. So really excited to see hopefully a multidisciplinary audience apply. So if you're listening to this and you're like, I'm not an AI researcher, that's totally fine. There's a million and different ways. And like we've talked about this just throughout our conversation, economic approaches, information approaches, media approaches, sort of advocacy, societal democracy approaches, artistic approaches to imagining what we could do, right? So there's like room for everyone in this conversation of how do we tackle this problem. I think a few things we want to be really mindful of in these applications is, needing to ground this in reality and like tractability and the moment that we're in, and also be sensitive to like the sort of like safety concerns around this. Like we're not looking for proposals that are dismissive of AI safety or are dismissive and don't take seriously like the real ease with which it can happen to remove guardrails, right? Like that sort of piece of it also needs to be taken into account with any particular approaches. But we're really excited to see what happens. I think the pull model of innovation is a really interesting one, like taking inspiration from orgs like XPRIZE that have done this really well. And this idea of like, if there's a problem in society or a technology that we need that's not being addressed by the existing incentive structures, put some money out there and see what people come up with. And like just watching the list of what their carbon removal, their sort of giant RFP, much bigger than ours, but had like 20 teams with vastly different approaches from all over the world of like how to remove carbon from the atmosphere, right? So no matter where you are, we're really interested. So this is certainly open internationally. And so we're mainly looking also ideally for people who are either at nonprofit institutions or affiliated with them as well. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Emilia, thanks for chatting with me.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.